I could not be more excited to talk about intuition with you. Now, if you are a ambitious woman who is making your way in the business world and you are a leader, you are a CEO, you're somebody who knows that you're called to the business world, there is a tool, a cognitive tool called intuition that women specifically, or those who dance with the feminine energy, are more inclined to have access to than our male counterparts or the masculine counterparts to us. And so when it comes to discussing how to evolve our leadership, a lot of us women coming into the business world have been so conditioned to follow the path that we have seen succeed. And often what we've seen work has worked for men. And what I see with a lot of the CEO women that I coach and mentor and work with is a propensity to become more masculine than maybe their natural state would want them to be. And so today I want to talk about that. If you're an ambitious female leader, entrepreneur, somebody who is hell-bent on making your mark and influencing the world through the world of commerce, this episode could not be more important to you. And here's why. I believe that women leaders are uniquely positioned to utilize inherent feminine strengths and blend it into the business world. The business world is desperate for so many of the gifts that the feminine brings forward. And if you're like me, I spent a lot of my career just trying to understand the way the business world works and to fit into the frameworks, to fit into the mold that I saw women succeeding in. And the women that I saw succeeding tended to be more masculine, tended to be more hard ass, tended to have really, they were very boundaried around their decision-making process and very much favored logic over feeling. That also being said, when I would look at the landscape of the business world, where I would see women rising faster, because of course it's too slow for us, but where they would be rising faster in their influence or up the chain of command, were in two primary camps. And if you look at the representation of women across boards and in VP, C-level suites, you will often see women more likely to be represented, if at all, in either HR, and so managing people primarily due to a skill set around emotional intelligence, and or in art, creative, and marketing. And the reason for that, besides the fact that we've been highly conditioned to go after helping others and being artistic and creative, because those are much more rooted in the feminine energy than the masculine, what you will see is women finding that they are able to succeed there more than their male counterparts. Now, I'm being highly general when I speak about this, but that was my observation. But I didn't want to necessarily be the queen of HR or the queen of marketing, even though I love both a lot. I wanted to be in charge of the organization. And so when I looked at who my role models were, I looked for a lot of male role models. And the way that they engaged in the business world was very logical versus intuitive. But I believe women leaders are uniquely positioned to bring emotional intelligence to the table and deep understanding of emotions, but also intuition. And intuition, from a very simplified description, would be to be able to perceive what isn't clear that other people could see. For example, you could perceive something that isn't being spoken, but you can feel it. You perceive something that could be happening in the future or read a scenario, and it's not because you read 6 reports and have a background or a degree in a certain field of study. It's just something you know, that you know, that you know, that you know, and you can't really describe it. This is a phenomenon that has existed as long as humanity has been in place. And I want to spend our time together today really diving into what intuition is, why we're skeptical of it, why the world has not fully embraced it, at least the business world, and then how to start understanding that you're very likely already utilizing your intuition without knowing that's what you're doing. And so my hope is at the end of this conversation that you will feel like you understand what it is. You will understand maybe why you might have some resistance to exploring it. And you might start to recognize how it's already been part of your success story without you consciously knowing it. That's what my goal of the podcast is. Intuition, I believe, is a very inherent and natural thing. And that's why I'm pretty confident as we journey into what it is at the end of the podcast today. You will realize you've actually been using a lot more of it than you realized. And it's also not as mystical and dangerous as we've been led to believe. So let's talk about intuition from business leaders, because when I first heard about intuition, I actually heard about it through listening to interviews of some of my most esteemed entrepreneurs, people that I really look up to. And they kept mentioning intuition as if it was really a big part of their story. So I'm going to give a couple examples. By no means is this exhaustive, but I love Sarah Blakely. And she is the founder of Spanx, grew Spanx to $1 billion company with $5,000 in her bank account. The woman is just impressive. And she speaks in a lot of her interviews about how her leadership style is intuitive. Now, when she said intuitive, it made me wonder about that. But the way that more I learned about her story, the more she would say she's even quoted saying in a Stanford business forum, the business school in Stanford brought her in and interviewed her. And I remember listening to this interview and she would talk about intuitive leadership. And I would just think like, is that just like a touchy-feely emotional style of leadership? You know, maybe it's just the softer skills versus the hard skills. But what she described was really profound, which is she said that whenever and she would say, I'm a feminine leader. You know, I'm like, oh yeah, you identify as a female and you are talking about yourself as a woman in business, inspiring all of us. But what she described was really profound. She talked about how when she has a big decision to make and her team is feeding her context, giving her reports and giving her data to support her decision making, she will look at that and then she will check in somewhere inside of her. This is where people get a little like, what does that mean? But hold on, hold your horses here for a second. She said she'll check in with her intuition. And if her intuition disagrees with the data, the hard data that's put in front of her, she will pick her intuition every single time and has very few regrets of doing so. We're talking about a woman who for decades has built a profoundly successful business. And she says she will bet on her intuition over data every day, all day long, and typifies her leadership style as being known for that. That got my attention. Then Steve Jobs, who of course we all know is super genius and probably someone we wouldn't all want to work for necessarily, but he had some really inspiring things. And he spoke a lot about the importance of the role of intuition in his leadership and his decision making. And he is famously quoted for saying intuition is a powerful thing, more powerful than intellect in his opinion. He attributed a lot of his innovation and being able to see product lines before the world could identify that that would be something that could be valuable to humanity. Very innovative. Oprah Winfrey, another media mogul and philanthropist who has been very influential to me, talks about how her intuition guides her in her decision-making in both personal and professional life and considers it, quote, her greatest strength. Literally, not one of her greatest strengths, her greatest strengths. Got my attention. And so as we look at, of course, I'm nerdy as fuck. Like if you don't know that about me, I am not nerdy about everything. this is like the funniness of it. Like, I am not a nerd about a lot of things, but when I am a nerd about it, I deep dive and rabbit trail and have an insatiable desire to know things. And one of the places that I have gone on a full exploration and expedition around has been intuition in the past 3 years. And so when I started to look at, okay, what does the business community acknowledge from an academic perspective? Like, who's gone and studied these leaders to find out how intuition is being used? Because before I want to invest all this time into developing it, I kind of want to know what the landscape says. And there are 4 studies I'm just going to summarize quickly that are recent that I want to just draw your attention to. All of them, by the way, acknowledge intuition as being a highly valued tool set, specifically from positions of power and influence in business. And so in a study called Intuition and Entrepreneurship, and I can't even pronounce the name of these people. I probably should have Googled this before, but Holger Patzelt and Dean Shepard. Apologies for getting those probably incorrect in pronunciation. But they investigated the role of intuition in the entrepreneurial process. And they found that successful entrepreneurs often followed their intuition to make quicker, more effective decisions, especially in situations of high uncertainty where there was a lack of information. By the way, almost all of the studies done on highly successful leaders, which overwhelmingly skew to male leaders, said that intuition is absolutely a tool in the tool belt of these leaders, mainly when there's no other information for them to pull from, which is very different from female leaders, as I'll talk about here in a second. But a couple more studies that I just want to qualify so we have a better understanding for how intuition is being used in the business context. Another study called When to Trust Your Gut by Alden Hayashi from 2001 in the Harvard Business Review said that, and it was an article that basically talked about there are various instances where business leaders relied on their intuition to make critical decisions. And this included insights from executives and experts on how intuition complements analytical thinking. Notice that it doesn't necessarily replace analytical thinking from this article, but it was said to be an amazing complement and something that is useful. So for all those people out there that make fun of leaders for going, I just have a gut feeling, that's a definite phrase that comes from the house of intuition. And plenty of leaders know that to be true and have built this internal trust system with themselves to know that when their gut says something, they should trust it. That's not an analytical function, that's an intuitive function. The third study or article that I just want to bring up here is called Strategic Intuition by William Dugan from 2007. He talked about strategic intuition is what he calls it, which is a clear thought appearing in the mind spontaneously as a clear solution to a known problem. And he discusses it as it plays a crucial role in innovation and strategy. So this is sort of a really powerful concept of spontaneous drop-in of knowledge or a solution that was unconnected, like it wasn't a logical progression from a study of thinking or from experiences. It came out of nowhere, but it became a clear and obvious solution to a known problem. And so that's the way intuition has been described in that context. And finally, and the fourth one that I'll just mention here is a study called The Role of Intuition in Strategic Decision-Making by Eric Dane and Michael G. Pratt from 2007. And this study examines the role of intuition from the context of strategic decision-making in organizations. And their key finding was that effective strategic decisions often involve intuition, especially with dealing with complex, ambiguous information that cannot fully be addressed through the analytical process alone. This is profound because I don't know about you, but growing up in Western education systems, such an emphasis was on data, knowledge, known studied results, and logical rhetoric. So, and I debated for years in high school and college, and I really enjoyed the intellectual sparring of defending positions based on facts, based on arguments that you could construct. But intuition is not that. the cognitive process or the left brain emphasis in our business and in our education system is overemphasized, and what's underemphasized chronically is intuition. And there's a reason for that. I want to discuss how this has been vilified for us and architected to create a distrust specifically in women. But we'll get there in a second. What I think is really important is, as I was looking at about a year ago, I was really curious about what makes women so successful. And those that have become successful, what have been the trade-offs? What have been the earmarks of their success? What has been different about these women leaders compared to men? And so the studies that I just reviewed were predominantly from male participants, and certainly not from not a representative of marginalized communities or women being involved. And so a friend of mine who I dearly love, Rachel Ray, who sold her company for 8 figures a couple years ago. We were in a mastermind together and we became very good friends, and both are deep, deep feminists in our core and love the playing field of the business world. And we were really curious what the body of literature said about females. And the more we got into it, the more we realized females are not exclusively studied around their rise to success. And we know it's been a battleground for women. We know that we stand on the shoulders of women who marched on streets for us to be able to vote, who marched for us to be able to have maternal leave, all these different rights that by no means have we arrived at equality in America specifically, but we've made headway. But who's studying what the journey to the highest levels of success in the business world is from females? And so we started a study, the two of us in 2023, where we had a qualitative interview style with over 25 different C-level or CEO executives managing multi-million-dollar budgets and or having founded multi-7-figure businesses and 8-figure businesses and 9-figure businesses. And when we asked them about, and we didn't even use the word intuition, we were more stealthy than that. We asked them about how they would describe their decision-making style and what practices they had around knowing how to navigate crisis or unknown circumstances in their careers. And 82% of them said intuition played a vital role in their successful navigation of the business world. 82%. But here's what was interesting. Every one of them described what intuition was very differently, imprinting once again the idea that part of the resistance, I think, from the business community to really understand the power of intuition and how to harness and utilize it in our lives and in our businesses is the fact that it's so individual. And you compare this against teaching people how to be critical thinkers or logical thinkers. There's a path for that that's very linear, very predictive, and very ABC 1, 2, 3 that provides a sense of confidence around how to speak about it. And I think that's part of where intuition feels intimidating to the business world because it's so individual. So when we speak about intuition, I just want to kind of define it from a very objective standpoint. When I think of intuition, I think of it as a powerful internal advisor that can process a lot of information very quickly, offering you insights that you cannot arrive at logically. So I consider this to be a sense of you're picking up, you're sensing, almost like think of yourself like a human sensor, and you are perceiving sounds, thoughts, emotions, feelings, all information. Your mind is dropping in all these data points and you're absorbing all of it and creating quick takes on what meaning you can make from all of those sensory data points. And so it helps with people definitely rely on it when they're in crisis, when they have to move quickly and they go on their gut. our entire orientation makes us feel more comfortable when we give ourselves time to make decisions and we give ourselves a lot of time to review a lot of data. Intuition doesn't necessarily need data. It does, however, require you to have built a relationship with it, to understand how it speaks to you, how you perceive, because it's not really like an entity outside of you that's speaking to you. It's more of like a perceiving sensor system, like you're a computer and you have a sensory processing system, and you know that certain signals are given to you physiologically that mean certain things. But it's unlike a purely rational system that weighs pros and cons. So it's not like, oh, it's, always like this, or 75% of the chance is this. Like, it actually helps you recognize patterns and possibilities quicker than your conscious mind might have. And it allows you to maybe go beyond what your conscious mind sees as a possibility. And it goes into a sense of ideation that's very innovative, very outside the box. It is discussed in in a lot of contexts as a cognitive superpower that complements logical analysis. Now, in the world of energetics, because a lot of what I geek out about is the energetics behind success. And if you look at the energetics, there's masculine energetics, feminine energetics, and the masculine energetics are more on the logical side. The feminine energetics are more on the emotional, intuitive side. They are designed to complement each other. And when we look at the landscape of the modern business world, there is not an equal complement going on. And this is something that women inherently feel every single day, and we want to create equality around. One of the places that we want to create equality is around cognitive skill set. And to balance out the overemphasis of data, logic, reports, facts, and stacked experience, we also want to be able to bring ideation, creativity, art, intuition to the table, and have that also have a batting average that we have trust with. So intuition in business is not about abandoning logic or reason. It's about balancing that with instinctive understanding that comes from deep within you, knowing and allowing you to create more holistic and informed decision. And so in Western culture, there's parts of intuition that we widely accept. And this has been a journey around acceptance. It wasn't so long ago that all of intuition was considered dangerous and evil and vile and caused death in millions of cases. But as we ease into things, we're finding that intuitive concepts actually are widely recognized in the business world, and some of them are not. And so I just want to go through that because I think this is helpful in understanding all the ways in which intuition can speak to us or can connect with us. So some things here's 5 things that the Western culture accepts that are intuitive functions. First is imagination. You will absolutely see the Walt Disneys of the world praising the ingenuity, the imagination, and the innovation of their design teams or their R&D teams, their marketing teams, etc. The second is daydreaming. We have heard, certain people are just daydreamers, but the function of that is they're able to dream up scenarios and futures even that the world hasn't yet seen. And it's actually seen as a way that imagination can come out, is dreaming sort of lucidly, because you're aware that you're doing it, but you kind of go off into your own world and it rabbit trails you almost like Alice in Wonderland into different realities that you could then reverse engineer using your logical brain and start to help create new products, new ways of doing things, etc., that bring the business world into the future. The third area is visioning what you want from life. This is definitely something that a lot of CEOs talk about when they talk about their morning routines, when they talk about how they meditate or how they imagine how they want their day to go, how they want what the outcome is that they want of an important meeting before they walk into it, and they visualize it, and they visualize it in their senses. They see it, how it goes. They want to feel how they feel. I want to feel confident. I want to smell this. I want to taste this. I want to know this, etc. They really get into their senses, and it's seen as a really powerful tool. Also more of a personal development tool, but definitely something that leaders know to do. The fourth area is reading people and their vibes and making judgment calls based on a sense of, I just perceive this about this person. While there are certain litigation that could certainly arise from just making judgment calls on people, specifically in hiring processes or firing processes, the business world does not turn a blind eye to leaders who have track records of sniffing out when something or someone is off. And this is something that maybe isn't taught, how to read vibes on people, but it can be, it is acknowledged behind closed doors and given weight based on who gives voice to their concern or their perceptions. The fifth way is leaders blurting out a perception or an idea and being seen as a really creative and tuned in person. So often in brainstorming sessions, somebody might sort of their eyes glaze over, and they just kind of go somewhere else in their brain. And all of a sudden they have like a light, like almost like a lightning bolt of inspiration that comes, and they blurt something out that solves the problem. And they can't reverse engineer how they got there. They just know that they had a spark of innovation or a genius idea that was spontaneous and that just came, and we make room for that. How we explain it, we might just say that's just how so-and-so is. They have these random hits of genius, and we are excited every time we experience it. So those are some ways that intuition is made, we acknowledge in the business community, but there's another side of intuition that we continue to have a very skeptical and very challenged relationship with. And this goes into more of the esoteric side, which you know I care a lot about. So here are 6 ways, I think it's 6. Yeah, 6 ways that the Western culture does not accept intuition, specifically in business environments. Energy healing. It is not widely known that if somebody's having a bad day, to go to an energy healer and go get some energy work done and come back in and be excited that you've just balanced your 7 chakras and everybody is fine. In the West Coast, because I'm from California, we might just say you're just super hippie. But in the business world, that is not something that you would go in saying most of the time. Second thing is magical thinking or miracles. Like, you wouldn't see it as a business strategy to pray for a miracle. Someone might joke about it. Joking is different than saying it's actually what I'm planning to do. And so we write off a lot of intuitive concepts that might be really high in a belief system that others don't share as just magical thinking, and we make fun of it and disregard it. The third area we might disregard in Western culture would be visual downloads while awake. And so remember how I spoke about that brainstorming session where someone has a spontaneous idea? They might get it in thought form. They might also see it. With their eyes open, sitting in that room, they see a future, or they see a machine in their head before they know what it is, and they might not be willing to admit that that's how the information came to them. They might just say, I have an idea for something, and then spend time sketching out what their mind's eye showed them and then bringing it to the table, but they might not share the process behind how they got there, because that would seem weird or unusual to say, wow, I just saw like the blueprints of the perfect design for this. Like, that might throw some people off, so they might keep that portion hidden to themselves. Fourth area would be channeling. Channeling can be, is essentially having wisdom and inspiration flow through your mouth or your pen or your fingers as you're writing, or even as you're creating a design, where you have a sense, the creator, the writer, the speaker has a sense that these aren't their words, this isn't their idea, and this isn't their creative spirit, but they're like the physical conduit for it being born in the world. You hear this a lot more in the entertainment world, where people will say, I just heard the music. I just heard the music to famous songs, and they don't even take credit for it. They're not sitting there going, I was the genius who came up with the most memorable melody of all time. They simply say, I just spontaneously heard it. So that might be something that's acknowledged in highly creative art forms. But in the business world, you don't hear speakers going, my speaking strategy is I open my mouth after I get into a really great theta state in my brain, and I invite wisdom to pour out of my mouth. Like, if someone says that, it would sound to us as if they're saying, I am the mouthpiece of God and therefore a prophet in this room. And it would really turn a lot of us off, specifically those of us with trauma around religion. The fifth area is messages while lucid about the future. So if you're sitting in a business room and we're talking about the stock market, and we're looking at the holdings of the company, and you get a hit that you go, I just know the economy is going down. We need to have a more conservative approach to the way we're stewarding these funds. That's kind of a weird grenade to throw into a room of people who will feel more confident with reports, trajectories, cyclical, historical patterns, etc. And so unless you're willing to just be the weird, crazy genius in the room, most of the time we don't blurt that because it's not well received. It's written off as unusual behavior, concerning behavior, or just that crazy person. And the last place that Western culture has programmed us to believe that intuition is bad, or at least just is adverse to, would be instantly knowing information about someone else that would be deemed as private. This happens more often through back channeling conversations in companies where someone highly intuitive, whether they know it or not, simply goes, something's off with Greg. And someone goes, why? What do you know? I don't know, but we need to check on him because I don't think he called in sick for nothing. I think he's having suicidal thoughts, right? Like, if you're having that conversation with someone in HR, that's a very weird conversation, because now all of a sudden somebody's responsible for information that hasn't been validated. And then you've put yourself on the line as perceiving something and making your perception something that someone now is responsible for. And so we just find that we don't do that because we feel like it won't be well received, or it's hard to explain how someone would know that. And it's just awkward. And so we even see people who might know things, and even if they do know it's their intuition and it's right, they might find different ways to try to explain it than just say, hey, I have a concern about so-and-so. I don't know how else to explain it. Can someone call and check in on them? I don't think they were okay after their last performance review. I think they're, or I think they have a drinking problem, and it's not because you're sitting there drinking with them or you're reading the redness and the puffiness in their skin, so we also don't see the business world going, oh, wow, great insight. Thank you. Well, how intuitive are you? We find people just kind of recoiling and acting really uncomfortable with that information, which trains us not to bring it forward. And so because of this environment, I believe that women business leaders have doubts about intuition. And before we even get into how common intuition, I believe, is, and how you're probably already using it and already really known for and respected for a lot of that information, I want to just share 8 different fears that I think female leaders have when it comes to intuition, specifically when it comes to considering owning it, knowing it, and developing it. Because we might go, yeah, I get it. It's not for me, it's for someone else. But what I want to bring forward, and if you're still listening with me, is what if it's your superpower? And what if you've already been using it? And what if you developed it and strengthened it like a muscle group, you could rely upon it for faster, better, and more profound decision making? And what if that's unrealized potential? So let's just identify 8 common fears that women leaders specifically have, because women leaders typically have access to more feminine energetics, and the feminine energetics are deeply connected with intuition. From every historical community, anthropologists would say, like, women are inherently intuitive. There are entire societies that wouldn't send men to war until the wise woman in the community was able to say whether she believed they should or not, and how they should organize the troops. Like, this has been revered in ancient cultures as the power of the feminine. And so as women leaders trying to create respect in a male-dominated business world, we are sitting on a superpower that has been the hallmark of our influence in historical contexts, and we're afraid to utilize it. And here's why. 1, intuition versus rational decision-making. I think that women believe that effective business decisions are solely based on rational, data-driven processes. We are definitely taught this and we are modeled this. And for us to break from that in favor of something that's hard to explain and deeply personalized is a fear of stepping out and being seen and targeted perhaps by ridicule, or being seen as unusual, weird, or dangerous. The second fear that might come up is intuition is unpredictable or unreliable. And so we might look at intuition as, well, it's too vague. So you have this sense that this is the wrong decision, but why? You can't describe why, and you can't say what's better. And this is very common as we're learning to be intuitive and bring our intuition back. We get more vague direction than specific direction because we're working with it and we have yet to fine tune it. And so as we begin to work with intuition, there can be a fear that, I've just spent way too many years focusing on my data-driven, more predictable, fact-based, logical self to really feel comfortable starting to engage with this more unpredictable or inconsistent way of understanding information. And so because of that, we might not choose to lean into working with it and applying it and being okay that it might take a little bit of time to fine tune and finesse it. The third fear would be having, of course, it would be perception. We could certainly be worried that in male-dominated industries, in a male-dominated business setting, that we could be seen as less competent or less serious if we openly admit to using our intuition. Women have already been made fun of and ridiculed and marginalized by being labeled as emotional over being rational. And if you are a business leader seeking respect in the business world, you are highly motivated to move away from the irrational, emotionally charged female stereotype and be taken seriously. And so there can be a real concern about that. The fourth fear would be misunderstanding the nature of intuition. So we might have a sense of, intuition just seems like impromptu, spontaneous guesswork, or it's too impulsive, or it has roots in the occult, or it has roots in psychic places, and that just doesn't seem like it's useful, has any place in the business world. The fifth fear could be historical stigmas. So when we look at females, leaders in our background, if we come from religious or patriarchal upbringings, we could certainly have internalized the historical stigma around intuition, particularly as it pertains to women. And therefore, we don't trust or value our intuitive selves because women have for centuries been killed for their intuition. We also have gender stereotypes, the sixth fear that can come up around intuition, which is that, we don't want women to be seen, and I've sort of covered this earlier, but like we are very sensitive to gender stereotypes that unfairly categorize us as overly emotional, irrational, and we fear that this can undermine our credibility or authority as a leader. And so what we see a lot of women doing to succeed, because it works, is atrophying an entire side of them that's highly tuned in, highly emotional, and highly intuitive, and overdeveloping the side of them that's more logical, more data-driven, etc., when really their spirit and their soul and their selves would be far more happy to dance between both, or to have more of a flow between the two and be able to use them depending on what feels better at that time. But we just don't see there being a lot of space for that. And women are very motivated right now to break ceilings and to break away from harmful stereotypes that have held us back for generations, centuries. The seventh fear would be personal doubts. Maybe you've had someone share something intuitive with you, or you've gone to a reading or had an experience with someone that said they were an intuitive healer and it felt really off for you, or the information was disturbing, or the information really threw you into a personal chaos around your own decision making. And it just felt like it opened a can of worms you weren't ready for. And so you kind of step away from that because it feels a little too unknown. And the eighth fear could be a fear of mistakes, the fear of making a wrong decision and not having something quote unquote solid to back it up, and feeling like, having gut feelings or having a way of making a decision that isn't backed up and supported by a scientific academic community could make you look weak and insignificant as a leader. And so what I want to go into is, what if all of those fears, because those might feel really real, and you're like, thank you for acknowledging that, because that is true. I worry about all of those things. And you can tell me intuition is super cool, but I don't know how intuition is going to resolve that for me. And I'm going to just validate those fears right now, because I believe that those weren't simply just taught to us by society, but we actually inherited a trauma response from our generational trauma around women being harmed and hurt because they were seen as intuitive. And that is a very real fear that maybe we haven't personally experienced in our lives, but our great grandmothers did, our great great grandmothers did on all sides of us. And that fear response has come through to us in a way that makes us back away from anything that feels magical, back away from anything that feels like it puts a target on our back. So let's have a word from our sponsor, and we'll talk about where that conditioning is coming from. Okay, so something that's unique about me and the way I look at the world is I love learning about spiritual truths, historical context, psychological breakthroughs, different pieces from the healing community, I would say, and applying them to entrepreneurship. And I really believe that entrepreneurship is such a highway for personal development, because 80% of your results come from your inner work and your inner game. And so what I invite you into this portion of the podcast episode is to join me in being curious, because that's all I'm going to ask from you right now. You don't have to believe what I'm saying to be true. I just want you to be curious how the words I speak land in your heart, whether they land as true or not. I really believe you are your own guru. You are your own guide. You are deeply, deeply wise. And if you're curious about intuition, the path to unlocking intuition is not learning new things. It's remembering what's inside of you, which is very different than I think a lot of teachers will teach. The intuition is about remembering something that's very deep, something that's very sacred within you, and understanding that you have everything you need inside of you. But I'm just going to help create a little more curiosity, hopefully, and a little more of a sense of safety, exploring and seeing how that is working for you. But ultimately, you are your own sovereign soul that is here to decide if this is true. So something that's very much a heart of what I do when I work with entrepreneur women is we look at the ways in which society, their conditioning, and generational trauma is affecting their leadership. And it's such a beautiful exploration, because leaders, we are so handicapped by all humans are, but as leaders, you're choosing to be more visible in your imperfections. And so as we start to uncover, what's holding us back, we start to look at what have we just accepted as true without questioning if it is. And that brings us into a really rich exploration. So when we've just gone through talking about intuition, how the business community is celebrating it as a cognitive tool that is a perfect complement to the logical, data-driven side of how we make decisions. And yet there's fear, specifically with women. And I want to go into the historical reasons why women specifically hold stored trauma around activating, working with, and unleashing your intuitive superpowers into propelling your success in personal and in professional settings. It is really sacred work here, because women have been systematically boxed in. And one of the major ways women have been taught to suppress their wisdom and to doubt themselves is their inherent gifted intuition. I believe all people are intuitive, but I believe women have always, in the history of humanity, cornered the market, if you will, on intuitive power, intuitive gifts, intuitive decision making. We know, I mean, there's studies that have even been done on a mother's intuition. I mean, you can even see how we take this out of the business context. Women will say, well, I just have a mother's intuition about things. And we have a sense as a society that that is true. There is such a thing as a mother's intuition. She can feel when her child's hurt. She can feel when something's wrong. She knows when something's off. And you might not need her to write a data report or go around and read her kid's journal or break into their social media account to know that she's spot on and to not question it and to go with it. We have that level of power at our fingertips at all times, but we have been vilified, harmed, and murdered because of it for centuries. And that trauma doesn't come from us just reading history books about this or watching movies that cover these time periods. This is actually stored in our DNA. And if you haven't listened to, I've already recorded a podcast episode about this. When I talk about how they've done studies that up to 13 generations back, you actually have visceral nervous system stress responses to stimuli and experiences that maybe you didn't live through, but great grandparents lived through, ancestors lived through, that you have a visceral and profound reaction or trigger to that you don't even understand. And so when we go into talking about why female leaders do not feel freedom to explore their intuition, we have to go to the history books, and we have to look at how intuition has been vilified systematically, specifically in Western cultures based on Judeo-Christian religious groups. So let's talk about this. I'm going to reference some historical events very briefly, but I think that if you are curious, you can definitely deep dive on this and learn a lot more about it. But we have historically had witch hunts, if you've heard of that, in medieval Europe and early modern Europe. Specifically, this is one of the most notorious examples, spanning 3 different centuries or 4 different centuries, where predominantly women were hunted for displaying or using any intuitive skills, because it went so flagrantly against what the church wanted, which was to have a sense of, you can only come to us to connect to God. And there was a sense that intuition connects you to God naturally, or to the energetics that we would see as divine. And that was a major threat to the church. And so they went and hunted women and burned them at stakes, tortured them. And a lot of these women, when you go into really what was, quote, what was really under the umbrella of witch, because a lot of times witch is just, you don't want to be branded as a witch, because if you grew up in Disney princess culture, like I did, before the age of 7, when your subconscious mind is just running around, like witches were the creepy, crazy villains, and you didn't want anything to do with that. But when I started to get curious about, well, what actually is a witch? A witch is actually, the definition of a witch is a wise woman, like who accesses wisdom. Well, geez, that's a concern, that we've branded any wise woman who goes against the organized religious control at the time. That's a very concerning description. So some things that you might not know, that I didn't know either, that women were killed for or seen as dangerous, are things that are very normal today. Things like having herbal knowledge or natural healing remedies. Somebody that might choose to have an herbal infusion to get rid of a cough than ingest a Western medicine. That might be totally normal in today's culture, but several hundred years ago, you would have ancestors that died for making a tea or a healing soup for someone who they really wanted to go to the church and have them, heal them in some other capacity. It would have been seen as threatening. We also see women as being seen as witches for being financially independent of men and being strong-willed and going against the church. Just that would have been said, you're a heretic, you're a witch. And that would have been a death sentence. You could have been killed simply for having physical features, specifically coming from that region of the world. If you had red hair or green eyes, you could be pronounced a witch simply because of those physical features. They also started to try to identify what mole placements or birthmarks could be associated to having witchcraft in your blood, and now you've inherited this. And people were killed for something like that. You could be killed for simply being accused by someone who is jealous of you, with very little proof that you've done anything. You could be accused for living isolated outside of a community, being seen as a weird woman, a loner, someone who was a hermit. You would have been called a witch. Women who had birds or cats as pets were seen as dangerous. A woman who lived outside of the area and they went through a famine, any of those farmers could have pointed to that woman living in isolation and accused her of casting a spell and harming an entire harvest of produce with little to no proof. And then any woman who would voice a premonition or a sense of the future was oftentimes stifled by her own family, saying, you can't say that because you will die. And if you die, they're going to start looking at our entire family. And all the women in our family are now potential candidates to be killed simply because you have this gift, which would have been known as prophecy in ancient times. And so that's really what's really sad, is that these women for 4 centuries, we're talking about multiple generations, would have been hunted and or taught or forced to suppress gifts around intuition, such as understanding medical properties of herbs, deep insight into human conditions that went outside of that knowledge group at the time, and would be viewed with fear or suspicion, leading to tragic consequences. Whether you have lived through that, I guarantee your family has lived through that. And even if your family and heritage doesn't come from Europe, any place that was colonized, any groups of indigenous people that were colonized by Judeo-Christian missionaries would have been also vilified for anything that corresponded to different spiritual rituals, ways of connecting to nature, ways of connecting to the divine that were not seen as, being done with underneath the umbrella of Judeo-Christianity, and they would have been killed as well. And so even if you don't come from that part of the world, understand that you have ancestors that were hunted for acknowledging that they had insight that didn't go through the church pre-approved leaders, most of whom were male. The second historical event that's really important is the Salem witch trials. Essentially, this is a dark period of time in colonial Massachusetts, which is a corner of America, in the late 17th century. Women and some men, but predominantly women, were accused of exhibiting any behavior that was seen as unusual or suspicious, however subjective that is, were for this period of time hunted down and criminalized as witches. And even between these two, the witch hunts and the witch trials, women were systematically turned against one another. You know, if it were to be between you and I and say our families live next to each other and they were trying to eradicate the evil or the sin in all of these women, they could have gone to your home and said, you know, we will burn all your kids at the stake that we've just set up over here in town, unless you can name someone who's a witch in your community. Otherwise, we'll call you the witch and we'll string you up and your 4-year-old daughter and your 8-year-old son and your cat too, because we'll just throw that animal on the burning mound. So women were incentivized to turn against one another. And I believe this definitely connects to the sisterhood wound, the mother wound, and the what's called the healer's wound, that women don't trust women. This is pervasive in business. And I think this is also rooted in this generational trauma of women would turn against each other to save their children. And we have this sense of, I don't know how to trust the women around me because somebody in my lineage, this happened and people were killed in my family as a result of someone betraying us. The third area that is really interesting and sad is that when Sigmund Freud, who's the father of psychoanalysis in the early 19th century or the late 19th century and early 20th century, would study women's intuition, but he actually associated it to hysteria and mental instability. So he stigmatized it as being crazy. A lot of us women actually have visceral responses to the word crazy. If someone comes into your world and says you're crazy, you get more triggered than if they used a word like you're illogical. Illogical is more neutral to us. Crazy often holds a bigger trigger because women were institutionalized for bringing out their intuition. And it wasn't that long ago. We're talking about in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation. And then you look at the modern context and the cultural stereotypes in literature and in media. And it throughout history, through the stories that were told, through literature, through media, we know that literature and media have always been tools of propaganda. And there were definitely bodies of humans, specifically religious groups, who did not want women standing in their power, being able to connect to the divine and be able to undermine and refute what the church was saying. Very threatening. And so we have a history of stories and media, books, movies, where enchantresses from Greek mythology are portrayed as dangerous, mysterious, or unstable, or the portrayal of female seers as being really violent and drinking blood from chalices and being horrific humans. And these depictions reinforce this idea that intuition is something to be scared of and wary of, rather than a skill that's inherent to the feminine and a huge cornerstone of our power that was systematically oppressed, so that women would be disconnected from their bodies, disconnected from their inherent wisdom, and not trust their voice to speak up about things that the men in power would not want to hear. And so I'm curious how that lands in your heart, because when we start to look at this context, this historical background, and we look at the studies showing that trauma responses are inherited and passed down through generations, we might have an aversion as women business leaders to developing our intuition, not because we're right, but because it's been taught to us to keep us safe, to keep us small, and to keep us alive, which might have been okay 200 years ago, but is no longer necessary or in service for us now, as we are embarking on a time in history and a time in business where women leadership is exactly what the world needs to create peace. I am a firm believer that the events going on right now in Gaza and in Israel would not be happening if women were in leadership. I firmly believe that women would not let these atrocities happen. And there is a need in the world for women to rise in their intuition, to build a track record within themselves, to trust their inner wisdom and their power to navigate through crisis and through unknown events in a way that the world has never, ever given space to, but we are uniquely positioned to lead in that manner. So you can tell I believe in this really deeply. So let's talk about, how do you know if you're intuitive, right? Because I think sometimes we think of intuition as a personality trait, like extroversion or introversion. I either have intuition or I don't. The truth is, or at least what I have found to be true, and I'm going to try to be careful the way I say it, because I'm holding what I speak to be true. But I want to honor the fact that you might not be holding it as true, and that's also okay. What I have found to be true is that we are all intuitive. And all intuition is our ability to have a spidey sense, if you will, around what we can't see, taste, or know necessarily, that gives us information from an energetic field in support of us, in support of helping us. That there's an energetic field that wants to support you, wants to guide you, is working on your behalf. I find that to be very encouraging, and I have found a lot of proof that that is true, that good things can work out for you when you aren't running a one-woman show in a traumatized response of hyper-independence, and you start to believe that the world is actually working for you and not against you. And I know me saying that could trigger people listening based on your life experience, and maybe you have not found that to be true. So let me talk about how I found out I was intuitive. If you or you're really curious about this, I go into a much more entertaining and heart-wrenching saga of how I learned this and what I went through in my burnout to rise experience through my best-selling book, Take Two, which I will link in the show notes. It's also, I did the audiobook if you're like me and like to listen to authors narrate their words. But I went to Sedona after face planting from chronic stress at the lowest point of my life in total burnout mode. And I remember meeting with healer after healer. Side note, I had thought they were therapists. Joke was on me. They were intuitive healers. I didn't even know what an intuitive healer was. I just thought that was like a nice way of saying psychic. And I had a lot of religious belief that psychics were demonic and were super evil humans. And so when I started to meet with these healers, all I could do was say, Peyton, just take what's for you, leave what's not, and try to stay open-minded. And that strategy worked really well for me. I was able to glean a sense that they saw in me parts of me that I had hidden from the world. One of them was, Peyton, you're a highly sensitive woman. And I had not felt safe being a very sensitive woman because it felt like a burden. It felt like I could carry people's pain and I could feel their feelings, and I didn't know how to control it. I didn't know how to protect myself from it. And it just felt like I was a bleeding heart walking around in a very sad world, feeling the weight of that. And I remember closing down that part of me as a child and reaching for what felt stronger, what felt more like armor, which was to be more bold, assertive, dominant, more masculine, if you will. And that felt safer for me. It felt safer to protect me against a wall so that my sensitive side couldn't get hurt. And they saw that in me. They saw my desire to heal people. They knew that my obsession with therapy, with personal development, wasn't just so that I could become a success. It was because I knew deep in my soul, and this is where I'm saying, like, listen to my words and see if it resonates as true, because when these healers told me this, it was the most true thing they could have said. And they said, Peyton, we know that you were put on this planet to be a canvas and to allow your life story to be a piece of art that others could see themselves in, and that your work is to be visible so that people can get healing and get restoration through witnessing your journey. And when they said that, I was like, yes, I have known that my whole life. How would they know that I knew that? And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably also know that there's a big part of you that is very altruistic, that very much doesn't just want to make your life great, that wants your greatness to inspire, heal, and repair a lot of the damage in the specific corner of the world and with a specific group of people that you are uniquely called to serve. And here's the other thing that got me. When they started to describe to me what intuition was, because I started to ask them, like, can you describe intuition to me? Because essentially, I just think it's a pendulum, energy work, spells, and cauldrons and frog legs. Like, I don't even know, but it doesn't seem like something I would want to use in my life. And they would talk about ways in which your intuition speaks to you. And I started to realize I am deeply intuitive, and I have been my whole life. And then I had an ego death, which I smile at because I actually like ego deaths, as painful as they are. The part of us that takes pride in a dysfunctional portion of us, versus just allowing it to transmute into something more pure. I really do want to have growth in my life, even if it's painful. I've consciously chosen that. And I will have plenty of mentors say, Peyton, what if you got to choose growth without it having to be painful? And they've also challenged me on my desire for pain, because it's like, you don't have to make everything hard to have it be a glorious rise. Another part of hustle culture that's toxic. And so I used to just think I was smart. I was told by a lot of teachers growing up, my parents for sure. I even remember one professor in college telling me I had a moral obligation to go to grad school because of the way my brain worked, which was very flattering, but the economic view of paying for grad school and the debt relative to the earning potential never made any sense to me. And so that wasn't a path that I pursued. But I was told a lot that I was smart. And when I started to recognize the way intuition was speaking to me and giving me information, I had an ego death relative to the fact that it wasn't me that was saying the smart things. It was this deep well of wisdom in me that would blurt wise things that I wouldn't have otherwise had any business speaking, because I had no experience knowing that. So sort of, I would describe as like, I would have spontaneously smart ideas all the time, and I just thought it was a function of the way my brain worked, versus actually, no, I have built an inner trust to trust that those thoughts are smart and to trust that they need to be shared. And I had a batting average around that was pretty strong. I also started to unpack ways in which intuition was working for me, and started to realize, oh my gosh, so much of what I thought was just emotional intelligence was actually intuition. And so what I'd like to end this lengthy podcast with would be, there are 4 kind of key areas that your intuition typically speaks to people. And most of us are already aware and comfortable with some of the ways that intuition can speak to us through our senses. Because essentially, intuition brings you into your body, brings you into the fact that your body sends messages. And intuition gives you a pathway to acknowledge messages that you're perceiving through your senses, and allows you to make meaning for it that helps you very quickly make decisions and navigate based on the level of trust that you've built within yourself. This is why so many of us go, the path to developing your intuition is not about learning anything new. It's about unlearning the things that made you scared to go into the part of you you've always known. And that's a very big difference. So let me go through 4 different senses that your intuition typically speaks to you in. The first is clear feeling, otherwise known as clairsentience, which is French for clear feeling. This is the ability to feel or sense things beyond the physical realm in your body. And so I'll give you 14 different statements and see if you've experienced any of these. 1, you can sense energy when you walk into a room. You can know instantly if the vibe is off, and you can probably even pick out who the sour apple is in the room. The second, you can pick up the emotional state or feeling of others easily, sometimes even being able to name their emotional state before they've even acknowledged it to themselves. The third way is you get a feeling someone is watching you more than you'd like to admit. You have a sense of somebody's watching you. It doesn't necessarily mean someone is or isn't. It's just the sense that you're perceiving being watched in an energetic field, and that might give you information. 5, Or 4, you can get a sense when someone you love is in danger or in a really emotional state that's causing them discomfort. 5, you feel emotions in movies or books that you read in a deep, deep level. I'll never forget watching a movie called The Whistleblower that was about human trafficking and watching a woman be tortured. And I sobbed for 3 hours straight and I couldn't stop. I was so traumatized watching that experience. Now I'm very careful of what I watch. Chances are you are too. The 6th way is having had experiences where you physically felt other people's pain. Have you ever had someone describe a stomach ache and all of a sudden your stomach starts to ache? I one time walked into a hotel and I started bloating instantly and I hadn't had any food. And I walked into a dining room and just had a sense that there were some really unhappy people in that room. And I felt that my body blowing up was telling me that it was inflamed with their feelings. And why would I have ever known that or thought that? But it was just a physical symptom that was showing up around people who were unhappy. The 8th way could be having difficulty watching the news, feeling nauseous or sick to your stomach when bad things or hard things are going on in the world. The 9th area is you're sensitive to temperature, even slight changes in temperature you're aware of. So there's a way that you can perceive through your feelings. A classic one for leaders is you have a strong gut feeling. That's the 10th area that this can come up. A sense that your stomach twists or knots, or you just know that you have an answer, but it's not coming from your brain, it's coming from your stomach. 11, you need extra time alone. You're taking in so much sensory input all the time that you get filled up and overstimulated and you have to power down. Otherwise, you fritz energetically. 12, you have a feeling that your energy is always on, like a light switch. There's on or there's off, and you have a sense of your energetics being like that. 13, you can hold an object and get a sense of information about it or its owner. If you're a realtor, I'd also just throw this out there. If you've ever bought a house, have you ever walked into a house and sensed that people were happy there or they weren't happy there? That's an example of this. You've gone to a thrift store and you put on a sweater and you just have a sense of someone was sad wearing this. I've even one time eaten a piece of meat and I couldn't finish the rest of the meat because I had a sense that the animal was sad, had been abused. And even if it wasn't quote unquote something I could prove, just thinking that made me not want to eat this anymore. And then 14, you get chills when someone says something that is deeply resonant for you. I even get this in movies where if something's for me, I'll light up in chills all over my body. And I now know that that means that there was something that was spoken. And sometimes I'll rewind to capture it, that's sort of my energetic field saying that we're lighting you up because that's got an answer for you around something that you've been asking for or want to understand. So I'm curious if you identify with any of that. That's typically a place where a lot of females will, yeah, I do. I don't get all of that, but I get plenty of that. I experience that in my everyday. That's a sense that you're connected to an energetic field through your body's physical senses, through feeling. The second place can be called clairvoyance, which is called clear seeing. This is very traditionally connected to what we consider psychic. So people who are able to see or visualize events or images that are not physically present. Some examples of that, because that might sound kind of crazy. And some of these will feel kind of weird, but some of these might feel really normal for you. One, you get images in your mind's eye. You could kind of just picture something and you might see a diagram or you might see a shape. And if you're an architect, that might have a special meaning to you. If you're an artist, that might have a meaning to you. You might just see a business contract or an org chart and you just see a way that it can be reorganized and it's visual to you. You couldn't describe it outside of drawing it. And so you need to whiteboard it out. The second place is you get clear visions, whether that's picturing through daydreaming, visualizations and meditation, picturing your life, future home, future business, your vision board in very, very specific details, visual details. The third way this can show up is seeing physical forms in spirit. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll feel like someone has walked past me and I'll look and there's no one there. And sometimes that's just me perceiving some energies in the physical realm. Four, and this is very common if you hang out with spiritual entrepreneurs or conscious entrepreneurs, they'll talk about seeing repeating numbers to verify business decisions. Maybe you think this is the craziest thing. I remember hearing people talk about this and being like, there's no way I don't see this. I wish I could see it. Now I'm not magical. Now I don't have good intuition because I can't see these numbers. Then I asked for it. And a few months later, I was able to start seeing these numbers. So it'd be things like 1111, 111 on the clock, seeing 888 on somebody's bumper sticker or license plate number, seeing 1212, 222, and just catching that, like you would if you buy a car that's red and all of a sudden you notice all the red cars, all of a sudden you start to notice the same patterns of numbers show up in your life, and you can actually Google what the spiritual meanings of that is and get messages from that. Fifth, you get physical signs all the time that steer you in how to proceed. It could be something as simple as you are wondering if you should go into business with someone and you see a stop sign, and something in seeing the stop sign makes you go, stop, don't proceed forward. You're not ready to move forward with this person. And you're like, it's just a stop sign. Well, then you go, okay, I'm open to that message. And then you see red light, and have pick something up that says not this way or wrong way on street signs. And you're like, okay, I'm picking up on a lot of messages right now. I feel like that could be something around my decision to move forward. It could also be, number 6 would be seeing glitches in the matrix. Deja vu is a classic example of this, where you feel like you're reliving an experience that you don't exactly remember having had, but it feels so familiar to you. You cannot ignore that you've been there before. And it feels almost like is this illusion? Is this reality? And glitches in the matrix is a fancy way of saying you're blurred between illusion and reality. And there's a sense that if it is illusion, it has been a reality at a certain time. You can also see words answering questions in your mind's eye or directing you. That's one that's come online for me that's really interesting to be able to see. Like, I'll interview someone and I'll see like the words gifted one over their head. And it would be very bizarre to admit that in an interview that they're so gifted, but I could see the words, they're the gifted ones. You could also see auras around people. And all an aura is like a color, an energetic color, like a halo effect around somebody that has a color to it that can tell you about their energetics. If they have like a black aura around them, it means that they don't have pure intentions or they've been corrupted energetically in some way. If they have green around them, it can mean that they're a healer and they're really into being open-hearted and receiving love from the world, right? Like, so there's all sorts of different things. And if you put your hand up against a white paper and focus on your hand, you can start to perceive there's a color behind your hand. People who have vivid or lucid dreams, often very connected to being clairvoyant. Also, if you have children that have a lot of nightmares, and when they describe the nightmares, they feel really dark and scary, or they have a sense of being able to tell their dreams what to do. This is another sign that they're very intuitive and they probably need some protection before they go to bed. Number 11 would be, I see symbols that have special meanings for me. So it could be that you would have a language around numbers with your guides or spiritual dimension. You might also know that whenever you see a triangle, it has this meaning for you. Whenever you see a hexagon, it means this. And now certain symbols actually carry meaning to you and you're perceiving through symbols. And then the last one would be having a photographic memory, something that you've written down. For me, so I used to play piano and teach piano, and I wouldn't say I was it's funny, I could teach piano, but I could sight read decently well, but like I needed to sight read the chords. And if I couldn't remember the chords of a song because the sheet music was in front of me, I could close my eyes and picture the sheets and I could see the chord, and then I could play, a melody that I would make up based on the chord that I could see. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. Or if you've ever taken notes for college or for an exam and you note take in a specific way, you could close your eyes in an exam, picture the notes, and actually read in your mind what you had written down. So those are some ways that clairvoyance can show up. I'm curious if you identified with any of those. That's probably the most unusual. And then the third sense would be clear hearing. So your ability to hear or auditory perception. So this is being able to hear messages or information beyond the normal auditory perception. And so some examples of this that you might or might not have experienced is one, hearing sounds that no one else seems to. Could be that you've heard someone go, Peyton, or your name, Michelle, and you're like, who's there? And like, no one's there, but you're like, gosh, I just heard that. That's evidence that you can actually perceive through your hearing really well. Second could be you hear guidance in the form of a voice. This can be the voice booming out of heaven telling you go this way or don't do that. And I have heard that. So I personally don't find that to be the craziest thing I've ever heard because I have experienced hearing that voice. But also the way that it's more subtle is hearing a voice inside of you, like coming from inside of you, but knowing it's not you, it's not your voice. That kind of sounds weird, but if you know it, you know it. Like if you've had that experience, you might go, at least somebody's said it and been willing to admit it, because I would never have admitted that I've had that experience because it sounds batshit crazy. The third would be getting ringing in your ears. So all of a sudden you go through a period of time. And again, this isn't not in a medical condition. There are medical conditions where you hear ringing in your ears. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when it's ongoing, patternistic, not connected to any illness or disease. The fourth would be being a strong auditory learner. So listening to this podcast, listening to my voice and capturing information simply because you heard it. The fifth sign would be hearing songs that bring in insight or messages. Have you ever turned on the radio and felt like the exact words that came out of that song was exactly something that you needed to hear, whether that was to bring you relief, whether it was actually carrying a specific message? And so you're tuning into, you have a sense that the song may not be random. It might be choreographed for you. 6, hearing sounds like trains, bells, or crashes without seeing trains or seeing a bell or seeing a car crash, but you have a sense of that. Another one that's less traumatic would be a sense of you're always having a soundtrack in your mind as you're living your life. Like in the background, you always have some like epic heroes theme sort of happening for you. That can be another sign. 7 is you think in your head a lot and sometimes get thoughts that you know aren't yours, but you know they're right. This is why I thought I was so smart for so many years. This was the ego death moment when I realized, my gosh, these spontaneous thoughts that I know are good, somehow I perceive that they're not mine, and I also perceive that they're true. And in perceiving they're not mine and that they're true, I'm still willing to voice it. And then I got validation every time I did that. People go, wow, that was really perceptive or really good insight, Peyton. And that created a sense of trust for me that these were really smart thoughts. And I now know it's the way my intuition works. Another way of understanding that would be I hear my thoughts. Another sign could be, the 9th sign could be you hear yourself talk out loud. And you just orate your life. 10 could be you hear your name without being called and no one is there, no one else can hear it. 11, you can hear super high pitched sounds like dog whistles. And somebody is actually physically whistling for a dog, but it's such a high pitch. Most human ears aren't tuned to that, but you find that you can tune to that. Like you can hear and perceive really high pitched sounds. The last one is claircognizance. And this is also the French way for clear knowing. And claircognizance is the ability to just know something instinctively without logical reasoning. So if you've ever heard someone say, and this is the first thing that we would use to describe it, it's just, I know things without knowing how I know. I had a friend and business partner of mine say, I just know that I know that I know, and I don't know how I know, but I know it. And if you vibe with that, that's might make no sense and build no credibility or trust with other people, but you've built credibility and trust within yourself to know that that's a good enough reason for you to make a decision on it. The second way you might experience claircognizance would be random thoughts jumping in your head, giving you spontaneous information that you need to solve a problem or make a decision. So kind of a similar crossover to hearing a thought, but this is just like, you're not hearing it necessarily, you're just like receiving information. Think of your brain like a computer system, and it's like almost all of a sudden like a new program was just inserted and you just downloaded new information. And you're like, oh, but I trust it because when I go into that, when I receive that information, it tends to be true when I act on it. All right, the third would be knowing when someone's lying to you, just knowing. The fourth could be knowing when someone's cheating. The fifth is getting nudges to choose a different route home or option or path moving forward than you normally would, and not being able to describe why you need to take a different path than you historically have. This happens in business all the time. Hey, I know we normally do this, but my instinct tells me, my intuition tells me this time I want to pursue this path first. Let's try that out. Fifth way you can experience this is getting a feeling that you need to double check something, and feeling like it's sort of out of the blue. And it could be like locking the front door, checking on your kids. For me, it's been check that profit and loss sheet before you hand it to your CPA. It's off. And I don't know where it's off. So I'm just going to start scanning it, and boom, there it is. Oh my gosh, that is completely wrong. That profit is completely inaccurate. I need to go change this before we have this meeting and make decisions on our tax strategy based on a really inflated profit that is not true. Sixth could be, I think about someone right before they call me. So maybe you're thinking about a past coworker that you wish would come back to their job because you just love them so much, and then they text you and you're like, what? How did they know? Seventh would be, I know when someone is the one. It could be the one that you want to hire, the one that you want to invest in, the one that you want to hire as a mentor. You don't know how you know, but you know you are the person that I need next. It could also be in a romantic context. You get the next one would be, you get a feeling that you need to reach out to people. And then when you do, you realize why you needed to reach out to them. It could be that they were going through something and you didn't know. You just had an instinct that you need to call them. Something's wrong with my mom. We call your mom, find out she was just in the ER, and you're like, whoa, that's wild. You can also have a strong ability to read complicated situations very accurately. I'll also make a note here, if you're neurodivergent, you also have this capability. If you're HSP on the spectrum with autism, etc., you have the ability to perceive very complicated scenarios because you pick patterns out super quickly. And so this is also another way where neurodivergent people typically have an overactive or more active insula, which is called the seat of consciousness in your brain. And so they are more activated in their intuition than most neurotypical humans. Lastly, you're just a good judge of character. People just know, ask Peyton if this person is the right hire, or they'll take 5 seconds. They don't even need to go have beer with them. They just need to shake their hand and they'll know if that's the right hire. And that's something that we just build a relationship with over time and a track record with. So I'm curious, how intuitive are you? How much did you find these ways of perceiving knowledge to be something that you go, well, I've been doing that my whole life, or I didn't even know that was intuition. I'm so glad to know I'm intuitive. I've always known I had crazy abilities to do this, or really amazing strengths that were hard to describe to people. Or I've always known that I'm a very visual person, but I've never really thought of colors or numbers or symbols as having a language for me that I could learn, that I could decode my experience of life in a more meaningful way. Something that, to me, where intuition holds so much power for us, specifically with more feminine energy, is it leads to a lot of self-trust. When you develop your intuition, because it is like a muscle where you can work it and over time, consistently build a relationship with it, that when you need it most, you not only get really clear information, but you trust it. To me, the path to building your intuition is so deeply connected to self-trust. It is healing. It is sacred. So many of us women in leadership and just in life have been taught to second guess ourselves and to somehow believe that that's more intelligent than just believing ourselves to be right. When you walk a path of learning to explore with your intuition, and maybe you're not ready to bring it to the business world, and that is okay, but you're ready to explore just how much information am I perceiving that I'm writing off or ignoring? And you have decades of ignoring it, bypassing it, minimizing it, not speaking it out because you don't want to be seen as foolish. And you start to go, in these contexts, I'm going to start speaking it out and validating. I'm going to cycle back around to that friend I was worried about and say, hey, a month ago or a year ago, what was going on for you emotionally? Because I could feel you in that time. And have them go, oh my gosh, like I was really at probably the lowest part of my life and I was having suicidal thoughts. And you're like, oh my gosh. And your body lights up in chills and you're like, validation. And so if you want to start exploring your intuition, this is something I'm very passionate about. And if I get enough responses saying that you like this content, I will go ahead and create more videos about or in podcast episodes about how to do this. But when I'm working with my female CEOs, we do unlock the way their intuition works for them. And we start by making space for your right brain to speak. And so if you think about your left brain is logic, data, step by step, 1, 2, 3, ABC. Your right brain is spontaneous, it's creative, and it does not beat to the same drum beat. Like you can rely with your intuition or you can rely on your logical brain to come up with information fast. For example, Peyton, what's the chances it's going to rain today? And you look up at the clouds and you're like, okay, based on this cloud coverage, based on this, I'm going to say it's probably fine. The kids don't need rain gear. But then your intuition goes, they need rain gear. But you look up at the sky and you're like, what? Doesn't make any sense. I'm just seeing cumulus clouds and blue skies, but your intuition goes, just bring it in case, right? But you need to create space for your right brain. Most of us have atrophied our right brain. And unless you are an artist or a musician or a creative, you have probably so significantly atrophied this part of you that it's going to feel really weird to try to coax it out. Imagine you've put it in a cave and closed the door on it and told it not to come out. Now, all of a sudden, you're coaxing it out. It's going to take a little while. So just find ways to do it. The 3 favorite ways that I like to tell people to start is to carve out 15 minutes, 30 minutes a day and do something monotonous or mundane without distracting yourself or putting more information in your brain. For example, showering. Can't tell you how many people just have these best ideas of the whole world coming from a shower. Well, what are you doing in a shower? You are lathering with the same soap in the same steps. Step 1, I pull out the shampoo. Step 2, I do the conditioner. Step 3, I shave. Step 4, I brush my teeth, whatever it is. And you are on such autopilot that you've engaged your left brain. Your left brain is working. It's in autopilot, but it's working. But there's a sense that you have it in such autopilot that you've freed up the rest of your brain to just be, to just think. And so you're allowing information to drop in spontaneously. Now, it won't happen every shower because it's spontaneous. We know that one of the biggest killers to creativity and intuition is pressure and stress. So if you have normalized pressure and stress in your life and in the roles that you play, this will take longer. Doesn't mean it's not highly worth it, but just be patient with yourself. Also understand that intuition is a function of being, not doing. And if you are successful in business, chances are you are a productivity wizard. You are somebody who gets shit done. You even have a reputation about being the person that you can ask to get things done and you get it done faster and better than everybody else. And it's something you're both, victimized by because it leads to burnout and super proud of yourself for. Understand that intuition is not about doing more. It's about doing less so you can be more. It's energetics. And so if you want to, being in the shower isn't about turning on music or trying to rehearse something in your brain or trying to get your to-do list out of your head. It's about just giving your brain space to just be. Focus on being peaceful, being content, being grateful. You could also do this hiking. I love doing this hiking. I have an exercise I tell people to do, which is to count from 1 to 10 to engage your left brain. Every step is a count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10, and then start again, 1, 2, 3. And you do that 2 or 3, 4 times, and then you're really annoyed, but your left brain is engaged. It's now counting on autopilot. And at a certain point, that frees your right brain up for you to ask the right brain a question and get information. It's kind of an interesting thing, but I encourage you to try it. It's very interesting how you can get information that way. And then long drives. You'll also hear very, like, leaders will say, gosh, when I go on a really long drive, or when I'm sitting in the airport, or when I'm, doing something where they're like trapped, they can't really do something different. So they can't be tempted to go into productivity mode. They're sort of stalled out somewhere. They actually get their best ideas that just drop in. They call them downloads. That's kind of a spiritual community word, but I've heard it in business used pretty well as well. The other thing you can do is start to journal out intuitive hits that you get. Now, as women, we've often been taught to shame ourselves for having instinctive reads on people. And the way that this has been suppressed for a lot of us is, gosh, you're judgmental. So if you tell a friend like, oh my gosh, that woman that just passed us was so angry because you felt it. That's not you blaming, shaming, or making her less than. That's you blurting something that you just picked up. And you're not necessarily assigning a judgment to it. But in our world, anger is seen as bad. It's seen as very bad when it's a woman. So a friend, a loved one, a lover could hear you say that and go, damn, you're so judgmental. And so then you feel bad about it versus going, no, no, no. I just was sharing information that I received. So go ahead and start writing those things down, because the more you write them down, the more you're aware of how often it's happening. And while by no means will you be able to validate everything, for example, one time I remember in college, before I knew I was intuitive, standing in line at Trader Joe's and feeling someone behind me. I could feel their sadness. And I felt that a little child was behind me who didn't trust an adult in their life because they had been abused by that person. And I was like, wow, like that's great. That was so wild to me that I thought that in this line, and I felt embarrassed. Like, I have no business believing that about someone who I haven't even seen who's behind me. And instead of making myself wrong for it, what could have been such a great option would have been to go, interesting that you perceive that information. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not, but just start building awareness to what you're perceiving and what you're picking up without making yourself ashamed, wrong, or be seen as judgmental. And then you can start then the next level would be to start journaling out decisions you make based on perceptions, instinct, and intuition versus logic, and see how it plays out. Just see how it plays out. It could be that you get a read that someone's wrong for a role and that they're toxic and that they are messing with the energetics of the team. And you don't actually have proof because you haven't heard anybody say that they've said this or they've done that or they've told this client this, but you just have a sense. Well, write it down and see how it plays out. See if you're right. So these are some tips that are really great ways to start with this. And then if you haven't explored meditation, meditation is amazing for creating space in your brain and starting to work with freeing your mind from the anxieties and the clutter it holds. But not everybody loves sit-down meditation, so don't make yourself wrong for that. That's not the only path to making space for your brain. You can shower more, you can drive longer drives, you can hike more, put yourself in environments, and then just make the conscious choice not to inhale more information. Just make the conscious choice to make space and see what comes forward. So there you have it. That's sort of my initial deep dive into intuition and why it's so important for leaders to cultivate that. It's an untapped power for a lot of us women, or it's tapped, but we haven't thought about it in context of business. We haven't leaned on it when we have skin in the game. We've sort of just allowed it to be a party favor. What if it wasn't a party favor? What if it was actually the way you could run your entire business so that one day you could be a Sarah Blakely standing on a stage at Stanford Business School saying that your leadership secret is your intuition and that you trust it over data 10 out of 10 times and you've never been disappointed. Think of the power of that. Think how quickly you could make decisions, how confidently you could make decisions, and how much you wouldn't have to outsource guidance from other people when you could be insourced, which I don't even know if it's a word, but it should be. It's the ultimate empowerment to know that you have a deep wisdom inside of you that allows you to solve complicated problems, come up with ingenuity on the cuff, and navigate very tumultuous, emotionally charged environments with finesse and with confidence. What could that do for you? What could that do for your business? So if you are loving this and you want to explore and dive in more about how I really unpacked this, I can't recommend my book enough. It's definitely very digestible, very fun to laugh along with me at the funniest ways in which I started to explore intuition and just the way in which it really profoundly healed core pieces of my life, my relationship with money, my relationship to success and why I was driving myself so hard, my relationship to my kids and trying to navigate motherhood and being a business owner, really repatterning the way I engaged with my husband as my business partner, who I was the boss of, and our energetics were all over the place, and healed and brought my sensitivity back. Because for the first time, I realized my sensitivity that I have hidden from the world to try to be strong, to try to be successful, actually holds a big gift that is my superpower. And so that journey was very sacred and it was very well documented. So if you are curious on how this really got embodied and how it unfolded for me, that's a really great next read. Until then, I will see you at the next episode.